Welcome to the latest episode of the Informing Choices mini-pod. Artificial intelligence is a concept of building a machine capable of thinking, acting, and learning like humans. There is some debate about what artificial general intelligence actually is or could be, and even if something approaching AGI is achievable or even desirable. But let's go with this. Artificial general intelligence is the intelligence of a machine that could successfully perform any intellectual task that a human being can. So in this podcast, I wanted to take stock of where we are in the development of AGI, the ethical considerations, and the possibilities that achievement of AGI may present to society in the future. To have this discussion, I'm delighted to welcome back to the podcast futurist speaker, analyst, commentator, and author, David Wood. David, a warm welcome back to the podcast. Remind us about your background and your interests, if you would.
Steve, it's great to be here. My background is 25 years actually building real products with huge amounts of technology in them, very large software systems that I helped to architect. That was in the early days of the mobile computing and smartphone industries. Since then, my interests have spread, not just from one bit of technology, namely smartphones, but to the wider possibilities of fast-changing technologies. And just as smartphones took a long time to be established and then suddenly they were everywhere, and each year they've had more capabilities, I believe it's the same with other technologies, including artificial intelligence.
And that's a really nice segue into the first question. And there's been so much discussion about artificial intelligence, ranging from the naive to the fanciful. And given that backdrop about AI, what hurdles might development through to the adoption of artificial general intelligence face, do you think?
First thing to note is that AI is not just one thing. There is no simple description of AI. As you sort of hinted in the beginning, there are multiple ways of trying to define it. There are multiple technologies that each in their various ways have some aspects of artificial intelligence. And if we look with a viewpoint that there must be a single solution, a single recipe, a single method, we will not do well with the rich variety of possible solutions that are being developed. So AI is sometimes used for generating creative designs. That's come along in leaps and bounds in the last few months. If you say the right few words to an AI, it can come up with a creative new picture or even a creative new video that has never been seen before. So that's one aspect of AI. Other aspects of AI is when it looks at large sets of data. All the scans that have ever been taken of possible cancer in the breast, all the scans that have ever been taken of people's retinas, and is able to point out patterns that we humans have previously missed. Now, that's a slightly different field. Then there's working out possible new uses for old drugs that weren't very successful in their initial environment. They were rejected, but there's enough data about them, and the AIs can spot new uses, new antibiotic resistant, new solutions for some kinds of cancers. Then there's improving customer experience. All of us have sometimes wanted to speak to a company, asking them more details about their products. Why isn't it working as we thought? And increasingly that can be automated by intelligent chatbots. They're not hyper intelligent yet. If they had general intelligence of the sort you mentioned, they would be even more useful, but they are already pretty useful. And AI can be used to guide people in that customer voyage, but can also increasingly be used to guide us in online environments, whether they are games, virtual games in which there are many AI characters these days to add to the richness and experience. But as we wander into the metaverse, we will have AIs there. So there are many kinds of AIs, and it's hard work figuring it all out. And people can be led astray, sadly, by over glib promises by some AI vendors. AI is full of hype, or the AI industry is full of hype. That's not to say the technology is at the core weak or bad. It's just that individual claims made for it often go beyond what's possible. So the engineering of solutions is hard, but I would say this human understanding is key, and we must resist all cases when people can't explain to us what the AI is doing. If we have that approach, we shouldn't be surprised if we are let down and disappointed.
I mean, one of the things that struck me as you were talking there is that I suppose much of the development, many of the applications are invisible to most people, aren't they? And suddenly people become aware of the almost pervasive nature, I suppose, of some of these applications of artificial intelligence technologies you've just laid out. Is that one of the hurdles, do you think, that people, lay people, if you like, actually get used to the idea of the real benefits as well as some of the risks of these technologies?
Completely right. We have to take algorithms and AIs out of the shadows and see their consequences more fully, see what they're intended to do more fully, but also pay more attention to the externalities, which is when something happens beyond the simple economic intent of the product. So there are lots of externalities from the use of AI. So we have to elevate that discussion, elevate the awareness, not just of the general public. Frankly, we have to elevate the awareness of many people who are developing AI, people who are rushing along with one goal in mind, which is to make money, to attend to what they see as a market need, without thinking more fully about what kind of monster might be created. And I use that word monster advisedly, because that was the word used by some of the earliest employees of Facebook in later years as they look back at what they call the monster they had created.
Yeah.
They realized that the algorithms they were putting in place were manipulating people's psychology, playing with them, and they thought, well, it's for a bit of fun and people will be glad for it. Afterwards, they realized actually there were many bad externalities, many bad consequences of that. So let's elevate this understanding and insist on explainability and insist on one of the singularity principles I advocate, number one on that list, in fact, which is question desirability, question the consequences.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's an area that I'm always thinking about as well. Is it's great to have these tools, but we need to remember they're a tool, and actually work out what they might mean for us in the future. I think for me, one of the things you started to talk about at the top when you were going through some of those applications of artificial intelligence felt to me what some people, I suppose, might call narrow AI. Once we start to talk about more general uses of some of that intelligence, we really start to get into AGI. Perhaps that broadens the nature of what these technologies might be capable of. So do you see that as a big part, an increasing part of the ethical debate about how we develop and use these applications, these systems? And how will we keep pace between what we're capable of achieving through these technologies and the ethics that should underpin their use?
The first thing to say is that I'll let you into a secret. This distinction between narrow AI and general AI, which is a staple of most people's thinking. Narrow AI is what we've got today, capable in narrow fields, and at some future time there'll be some miraculous breakthrough and we'll have general AI, which is capable in every field. That distinction no longer holds up, and we have, surprisingly, increasingly general capabilities in what we previously thought was narrow AI. A system that is trained for one task turns out, in some circumstances, very quickly to be good at another task as well. Sometimes this is called transfer learning. A famous example was that the software created by DeepMind, a subsidiary of Google Alphabet, to play very well in Go, was slightly tweaked, and within just 3 hours of self-training was playing chess better than any human and better than any software that ever played chess. And so that same core algorithms were very quickly reapplied. More recently, a different team in DeepMind have created something called Gato, which I believe is Spanish for cat, Gato, and it was created a single model, and it was capable of doing 604 different tasks which were quite different from each other. So there was some analysis of text, there was some analysis of pictures, there was some actions in the real world, manipulating objects to fulfill a particular instruction. playing games. So this is increasingly general. And the surprising thing, the thing that more people need to understand, is that even the developers are shocked at how generally intelligent their systems, which they thought would be quite narrow, are manifesting. So it seems that some of our general intelligence, our vaunted skills, aren't as special as we used to think. There is the possibility we might get to full general intelligence by fairly simple modifications of what's already happening. And that changes everything. And as you point out, there are huge ethical questions about this. Now, ethics in this field sometimes has a bad name because there are some so-called ethicists who just periodically stamp on the table and say, hey, make sure this is fair, without understanding and analyzing that fairness has multiple different definitions, and that one definition of fairness runs in tension with other definitions of fairness. Or these self-proclaimed ethicists sometimes say, hey, let's just be kind, or let's just ensure equality. And each of these things, in turn, requires a whole lot more analysis. So rather than advocate these things, I'll go back to the first principle of ethics, which is just because we could do something doesn't mean we should do something. It's insufficient to say, well, it's there and it was awesome, so therefore I did it. That's been defended in the past by advocates of a particular Silicon Valley ideology, the ideology that if something turns out wrong, don't worry, we'll learn from it and we'll be wiser as a result, which is a fine working principle. But some of the failures of this technology are so significant, so huge, so all-encompassing that merely saying, well, we'll learn from our failure is not good enough, because the disaster, the damage could be not just harm, but ruin. So that ethical principle of thinking what we're doing, desisting from things merely because we like it or because we think it's a path to fame and riches, we have to push back against that. So let's say promote auditability, promote general systems thinking, promote peer reviews, and here's another one, make lying wrong again, which is said recently by the UN Secretary General, as I call it in my book, The Singularity Principles, penalize disinformation, although I think the UN SG's formulation is a bit more to the point. If people are making false claims about their products, which is often the case in the world of technology, what's the phrase? Fake it till you make it.
Yes.
Let's say promise future possibilities and we'll get people to sign up to us and we'll eventually deliver these possibilities. This is no longer acceptable because the dangers of this very powerful artificial intelligence are just so significant.
What I'd like to do is kind of move on from the risks associated, which you started to kind of talk a little about there, but really focus on the possibilities, because at the same time we talk about the concerns we might have about how these technologies are developed, then the possibilities for humanity in the future, for AGI, for the creation and use of superintelligence for the benefit of all of society, are absolutely enormous, aren't they?
Well, that's a very good point. And I'm never sure whether to lead with the urgency of the risks or with the awesomeness of the possibilities if we get AGI right. So the more capable AI is, the more it's able to help with the kind of drug discovery I mentioned earlier, but analyzing much more of biology and suggesting very innovative interventions to deal with diseases. So just as the infectious diseases that used to kill most people around the 19th century and the early 20th century, the leading causes of death were pneumonia, influenza, and tuberculosis and gastrointestinal infections. And most of these were put to aside. They're not completely gone, but because of the technologies of microscopes, because of the technologies of creating new molecules, vaccines, antibiotics, all things that grew out of the second industrial revolution, that has changed the deadliness of infectious diseases. Well, in a similar way, the diseases of aging, the chronic diseases such as cancer, heart disease, stroke, diabetes, all the other things that become more likely as we age, they can be reversed by applying the tools of the fourth industrial revolution, which is just getting underway and which is most of all underpinned by progress in AI. So we'll be able to intervene and wind back the time in ourselves, and so that even though we are maybe chronologically 80, biologically we'll be 30. And that's a remarkable possibility, which I call the abolition of aging. But that's only the start of the possible sustainable superabundance that new AI can deliver. Yet another group in DeepMind, by the way, I'm not receiving any money from DeepMind to say this, I'm just objectively reporting from the front page of various Nature magazines. This other group has come close to solving a very long-standing engineering problem, which is the engineering of nuclear fusion energy, which is when we replicate in a controlled manner in restricted circumstances on the Earth the way that the sun produces its energy by smashing together very small molecules and creating slightly larger ones through this process of fusion and new energy being emitted. Since 1955, nuclear fusion experts have said maybe in 20 years' time, we will master this process and we will have unlimited, clean, abundant energy with no radioactive side effects. And it has always been pushed back and pushed back because it's too difficult. But in the last year, the progress with AI to control in real time what's happening in these very hot plasma interactions, and also to design better geometries in which these plasma interactions take place, governed by new semiconductors, that has the possibility of bringing nuclear fusion finally to a reality. And I won't say necessarily 20 years in the future. I think it could come as soon as 10 years in the future. And AGI would accelerate that process, as I said, to possibly within 10 years' time from now. So that's an astonishing set of possibilities that AGI could achieve for us. I summarize it by saying that AGI could become like our guardian angels. And we might say to each other that we are looked after by machines of loving grace, if we get this right.
That's absolutely fascinating. Only if we can think about our recent past, then the ability for us to create abundant health and abundant energy when we think about the COVID pandemic and the current fallout from the war in Ukraine seem to be absolutely wonderful objectives that perhaps this technology could be put to. But I wanted to take some time at the end of this podcast just to think a little bit about an initiative that that you're currently leading, because in many respects, I think this is related to this topic, and especially the idea that AGI can support the development of a more human-centric future. So tell us a little bit about the Future Surge, if you will.
Future Surge is a new name, a new orientation, a new rejuvenation of an old organization called Transhumanist UK, sometimes also called the Transhumanist Party UK, which was a political party, but also a general political initiative. Why political? Well, let me just talk briefly about what needs to change in our society so that we can take full advantage of the possibilities you and I have been discussing. I see 4 levels of exponential enlightenment, to use some rather grandiose terms. The first level is when people get excited about the positive possibilities and say, wow, look at this change. Exponential improvement in technology is going to be wonderful. The second level is when people think a bit more and say, ooh, exponential changes in technology could be disastrous. We could lead to more of the genocides and hatred and destruction. The third level is when people say, okay, there are these possibilities. Now let's figure out how we as individuals or as businesses can adapt. And I think this is the main focus of your podcast, Steve. It's giving advice to people and businesses how to spot these exponential trends and how to ride them. But I think the most important thing to do is there has to be changes in our social and political landscape, things like a new social contract, taking into account the fact that more and more people will not be able to earn a living by getting jobs because AIs will be better at doing them for less cost. We need to transform education so that what people are learning at school is no longer the 3 R's, it's no longer the set of skills that made sense for the 1980s or the 1990s, but a new set of skills is required. And I call that the vital syllabus. That's at vitalsyllabus.org. And more generally, we have to improve the political and geopolitical interactions, which is the hardest thing of all. But it's something we need to address so that the politicians are sending public money into the things that are most required. They are subsidizing the right technologies, and they are regulating against the worst offenses. And that's hard. And that's where Future Surge, which you can find at futuresurge.org, is seeking to do, building on the singularity principles that I have spelt out in my book of that name, the Singularity Principles, and trying to take this into public discussion, building bridges with like-minded organizations, but making sure that they're all aware of the lower levels of that exponential enlightenment. You know, if we aren't aware of these things, then what we're trying to do at the political level will surely fail.
Does that include the education of politicians as well? You know, it is the educational level of politicians globally, not necessarily just nationally, and you'll know exactly why I'm saying that. But, you know, is there a need for politicians to be more educated about these possibilities so that some of the decisions they might make may be more suited to a longer term future?
So some politicians are fairly well educated. I look at, for example, Ed Miliband in the UK. He is the person on the Labour shadow front bench responsible for energy. He has studied that to a great extent. So, and he's just one example. I'm sure there are people on the other side of the House of Commons who have a lot of knowledge as well. But by and large, politicians don't spend much time thinking about these transformational technology possibilities. By and large, they are stuck in the crisis of the present, and we do need to educate everybody. So the vital syllabus that I'm creating with help from a team is targeted at everybody. We say that the material in it should be comprehensible and engaging for an averagely intelligent 16-year-old, but it's not just for 16-year-olds, it's for people at all ages, people who want to learn more. And the problem is when people realize, hey, maybe I should learn more about AI, as I said earlier, they can be so misled by hype and unreliable information. So we're gathering more reliable information about the key points. I don't expect to reach the politicians straight away. They are very busy, but I do expect to reach the advisors to the politicians, or more modestly, the advisors to the politicians, so that they will become urgently aware of the need to pay more attention to this. And as they understand it, then the messages will cascade, hopefully, to the people who are in control of the public purse strings and control of the regulatory systems.
Well, David, that sounds absolutely fascinating, as was the whole of the conversation. So thank you so much for your time today. That's been absolutely brilliant.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for the great questions.
So to learn more about David's work, do look at the contact information in the podcast description. And thank you for listening. Do let your friends and colleagues know about the Informing Choices mini pod, and there'll be another episode along very soon.